Labadina! I have a confession to make. I bought one more tool. And actually it's highly expensive for the utility it has. But it's worth all the money because it's no longer about the tool, it's about the design and designer himself. But the problem was that I found a tiny note in the package and it stated that I don't need this tool. And honestly, I have to obey. I'm thinking to send it back. But I'm not gonna send it in the form I received it in. I'm gonna add an extra utility to it. And you already know where I'm going with that. I'm gonna place this screwdriver, which is called kinetic driver, into one of my epoxy lamps. But first of all, I had to think of some kind of composition to make it more interesting. And I remember that I had this old camera somewhere, so I decided to sacrifice it and take it apart and put it into the casting. My thinking was that I need something which would represent the main utility of the screwdriver, which is taking apart small things, small electrical components. It's for really teeny tiny screws. Without any clear composition in mind, I just started taking the camera apart and I felt how great this screwdriver works for these applications. For a short moment I even started considering keeping it for myself, but eventually I stayed on track and kept on going with my idea. So I'm in my zone taking this thing apart and suddenly zap! I got hit by some electricity out of nowhere. But once I looked in deeper, I found that this was from the flash capacitor, so I discharged it and kept on going. It was so fun to use the screwdriver that I got carried away a bit and I removed every single screw from the camera. Now it was time to put some screws together and find the idea of the composition. So I'm using that black box which is exactly the size of the casting as a reference, just to see where the composition lands and how it looks. And my idea was fairly simple, to make the screwdriver as a centerpiece and make it look like it's a bullet, like everything is flying in shrapnels outwards from the centerpiece. So yeah, that was my plan. What I realized though, that the composition will not fit in the regular form I typically use, so I needed a bigger form, which I had laying around. I made it for some casting, but I have never used it, so now it was a perfect time. So as you can see, I made the bottom plate from plywood and two side plates from polyethylene, and those side pieces are just to reduce the volume of epoxy. Once I had the bottom plate, now it was time to place the composition and stick the pieces onto it. And my method is as simple as it gets. I'm using CA glue with the activator and a bamboo stick to apply the CA glue precisely, because those pieces were really tiny. Once I secured the pieces in the orientation I liked, the next step was obvious: fill the form with epoxy. So I'm starting by mixing up some epoxy. I added a little bit of tint and placed it into the degassing chamber. While it was degassing, I prepped the form, carefully placed the composition in the form, added those side pieces to reduce the volume. I even added the corner piece because I was a bit worried that I will not have enough epoxy mixed up. Anyhow, I filled the form through this mesh. I typically use this mesh for filtering varnishes, and that's just because I saw some specks of dust in the epoxy and I just wanted to filter those out. Typically, this type of epoxy cures in 2 to 3 days, but it cured overnight. It always does because I fill the bigger amount than allowed, and that's because I want those bubbles, I want those cracks, I want that magic to happen. And if you know me, you know what I mean. Once I had it out of the casting, I knocked out the bottom plate and started cleaning it up, making the sides a bit more flat and square, so it would be safe to use it to cut it on the bandsaw and on the bandsaw as well. Though cutting on the bandsaw didn't go as smoothly as I thought it will. I hit some steel inside the casting and I wasn't really sure where that steel came from until I made the cut fully. I realized that I was cutting through the SD card casing, which was made out of steel tin, and that dulled my blade completely. But I would make this cut once again because it revealed such a great cross-section of the electronics. Yeah, it looked so great. Anyhow, after making the cuts, the sides were looking really rough, so I moved to belt sander and smoothed the sides. Then I switched on to Mirka orbital sander and sanded it all the way up to 1000, maybe even a bit higher grit. I apologize for those who have seen me making these lamps, because you can already guess the next step, which is gluing a slim cross section of 80 by 80 steel tubing on the bottom of the casting. And that's needed because I will have to suspend the casting in the silicone mold and fill all of the sides with a very thin layer of clear epoxy. And this step is needed because after the first pour the form is really porous, so to speak. I have some cracks, I have some open bubbles and all kinds of inconsistencies, and that's why I made the silicone mold to create this consistent, even look for every piece I make. So now I'm placing it into that silicone mold, suspending it with some magnets and filling the sides with clear epoxy. Even though I was using just the same epoxy, I was able to remove it from the mold only after 3 full days. And that's because epoxy cured slowly, just as it's supposed to. If everything goes according to plan, after removing the casting from the silicone, all that's left to do is sand away the overflow from the bottom, and the form is done basically. But somehow I placed the magnets too deeply when making the second pour, and I was left with these indents. And unfortunately I wasn't able to sand away the epoxy up to the metal because I was already reaching the limits of the form. Well, it's hard to explain, but basically I had to build up some material on the bottom. So I placed some thin magnets on top of the metal ring and filled the rest with some epoxy, and it worked out really well, apart from one tiny problem that I had some bleed out under the masking tape, and now I had some fine sanding to do. After an hour, maybe about 90 minutes of sanding and polishing, the casting was done. And now I had to make the base for it. I thought going with already finished base, but the problem was that the magnets were not in the right orientation. The polarities were different and I wasn't able to attach the base. So I chose to go with the blank one. Without any magnets, I mean, it's only varnished and no electronics, no magnets are in place. And I also thought maybe I should darken the walnut because it doesn't match the design, because there's no such color as walnut in the casting. So I sanded away the varnish and applied some vinegar and steel wool mixture, which ebonizes the wood. It darkens naturally because of the tannins inside of the wood. So once I got it dark, I had to varnish it again. So I mixed some polyurethane lacquer and applied a couple of coats with a light sanding in between the coats. When the varnish cured, all I have to do is put all of the components into the base and call this project finished. I just had to make sure not to mix the polarities of the magnets. Typically it doesn't really matter because I don't place magnets into the casting. There's only a metal ring inside of it, but this time I had to make sure to arrange the magnets in the right way. The build inevitably reaching its end, so I sincerely thank you for being with me and I hope to see you soon. Bye bye!
Thank you.